what weed addiction is like from a stoner of 15 years. Hi, my name is Becca, and I have been cannabis free for 4 years coming up in 2 months. And in our community here, we talk about addiction and recovery. So if that's something that you're interested in or that resonates with you, you're welcome to join us. So, weed addiction, I know that that can be kind of passe because weed is not addictive, right? Well, not for all of us. And I know that some people may beg to differ and may want to argue that weed is harmless and that you can't become addicted to it, but I was for 15 years. And I want to talk about it now because I haven't really ever broken it down. So I'm going to start from the beginning. Weed has been a part of my life for a very, very long time. My first memories and my first experience with weed was when I was about, let me think about it in particular, 14 years old, because I was a freshman in high school the very first time that I smoked weed. And some friends and I went to the movies because I'm from a small town and there wasn't a lot to do where I was from. So it was basically like the movies, or you drive 45 minutes to the mall, or you go to people's houses. And so the movies was, one of the cool places that we would go. And it was the summer actually before freshman year of high school. And somebody brought weed to the movies, and they made a pipe out of a soda can that they bent into the perfect shape, and they had a safety pin with them, and they poked little holes in it. And we went to behind the movie theater and we all smoked it, and I didn't feel anything. So I was like, okay, whatever. But there was something so cool. Like the kid that brought it, he had already been, smoking for a while, and he was this cool, rebellious skater kid. And I remember he kept the safety pin on his shoe, like on the shoelace of his shoe. And I just thought it was so cool. And literally from that moment on, I kept a safety pin on my shoelace the way that he did. And so I share this because even though I didn't get high that first time, there was something really intriguing to me about like the stoner culture. And so a little bit of time went on. I will mention that I had a really rough family life. I had a really rough upbringing. You can check out in other videos. I'm not going to get into it much here, but things weren't good at home. And weed became more intriguing to me because as I moved forward and then I did try it and I got high for the first time, it provided an escape for me. And I will mention too that the first time that I got high, oh my gosh, I'll never forget it. A friend of mine came over and we waited until I was living with my grandparents at the time. We waited until my grandparents went to bed. And I hadn't tried weed again after the movie theaters thing. But when she came over and we tried it again, I got really high. And I remember just rolling around on the floor laughing, and we were having the best time. And I have this memory, and it's kind of popped up in different times through my life, that I remember, because I got the munchies, of course. I made a bunch of food, and I remember cleaning up the kitchen after I had made the food. And I remember this feeling of my movements becoming very methodical. And I remember being in this headspace of like, wow, because I'm cleaning up, I'm wiping down the counter, and there was something about it that just felt so good, and so like I was, focused but not focused, and I was able just to like mentally be checked out, but I was still like it made the work easier, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It made it easier and more methodical. So moving on from there, things really started to fall apart at home, and I started using weed somewhat regularly to just escape from what was going on. I ended up leaving home when I was 16 years old to follow the rest of the members of the Grateful Dead and Phish. It was the late 90s at that time, and I had shortly before that really fell into like the stoner crowd at the high school that I was in. And I was not only smoking it on my own at home to kind of just check out, but I was hanging out with these stoner kids, and we would, smoke a bunch of weed and then just, go do things around town, or we would drive to the beach sometimes because I lived close to the coast where I'm from. And so I remember just kind of creating my own little world, not only by myself when I was smoking weed alone, but in this small little group of stoners that I was in with at the time. And that was actually who the girl that I was hanging out with at that time in that little group was, who brought me to my first Phish concert. And that literally changed the course of my life. And I was in between my sophomore and junior year of high school when I went to that first Phish concert, and I ended up dropping out the second week of my 11th grade, my junior year. And I left home and I did Phish tour and the rest members of the Grateful Dead tour. And so you can imagine, because of, the hippie life and the environment and the culture that I then became a part of, that weed was always a part of it. And everybody smoked it. I then moved on. I met people who lived in Northern California, and I ended up in Humboldt County. And I ended up working on my friends' weed farms at that time. And Humboldt County and the Redwoods will always have a special place in my heart. And if you know anything about that area, California as a state was the first state to introduce medical marijuana. And Humboldt County, California, which is north of San Francisco, has always been known for their weed and their weed culture. And that's where I would spend my off times when tour wasn't going on, was working on these weed farms. So it was always a part of my life. When I did leave home, though, I want to mention that as I was traveling, and when I would settle down, I would use it more. But when I was traveling, I really wouldn't smoke a lot of weed, because at least for me, a lot of people that I knew weren't on point. But for me, that was the time that I would make a lot of my money. And I was putting myself in situations where, I'm selling weed, I'm selling mushrooms, I'm selling different substances at these concerts. And I needed to be really sharp, and I needed to be on point if I was going to make enough money. And not even enough, but my goal was to make as much money as I could in the time that I had to do it, which was a few hours before the concert started, and then a short amount of time when the concert let out. So I had to be on point. And the tours themselves were oftentimes pretty grueling, meaning we would have to be from one state to the other overnight sometimes. So I had to be on point, and I wasn't staying super baked during that time. But when I would settle down and during the off season, I would definitely consume more of it. As things went on in my life, I ended up completely stopping working with weed and smoking it. I settled down after a solid few years just being on the road and spending my off time in California. And I moved to Colorado, and I ended up having my son when I was 20. And so I had stopped smoking weed during that time. I got a real job. I had my son. I was kind of like against it in a way. And so there was that season of my life where I wasn't consuming it. But then things started to get kind of difficult as a new mom. I was in a really unhealthy, abusive relationship with his dad, and we were moving around a lot. So weed became the way that I dealt with it. And so that's kind of how it snuck back into my life. And that's when I started to see an actual physical dependency to it, because throughout, talking about my history and my beginnings with cannabis, I never was physically dependent on it. But at that point in my life, I became physically dependent on it. And what I mean by physically dependent, because cannabis addiction is different than, say, like an opiate addiction or an alcohol addiction. Cannabis addiction, there is a slight physical dependency, but it's a lot of times mental. And for me, what really spawns the habitual use of it and the addiction to it was that when I would smoke weed, I would not feel the best when I would come down from it, and I would be spacey and I would be tired. I'd be a little headachy. And so I would want to then use it again to be able to not feel that way. And then what that translated into was I ended up being stoned for 15 years, kind of because of that. And if you have been dependent on weed, you also know this too, that like a lot of your like bodily functions, like not digestion and eliminate, actually, maybe it does affect that too, but like more so what I'm talking about is like sleeping, eating, focusing, motivation, like those kind of functions become interwoven with needing to be high to do them. And so that's what I mean by addicted to and dependent upon it, was that I needed it from the moment that I woke up until the moment that I went to bed, because I needed it to have an appetite. I needed it to motivate myself. If I was going to do the dishes, anything that I would do, I would smoke weed before I would do it. And anything that I would do that I couldn't smoke weed throughout it, it was always going to be the first thing that I would do at the end of it. So what this meant, like I said, was that I was high for 15 years. And so like, okay, what does that even look like? That looks like, and let's like look about how that like an impact in my life. So like I said, had my son, I started to use it habitually. And as much as like an avid weed smoker or advocate may want to swear up and down that, weed isn't bad and it's not going to affect your life in any ways, you know what? I will say though that we're all different. So maybe that's the case for you or for whoever, but that wasn't the case with me. Weed and being addicted to it really did affect my life. It affected the course of my life, because what happened was I ended up getting a job at a hippie cafe in my neighborhood here in Chicago, where it was accepted. It was kind of just a part of it. Like we all smoked it. We all smoked it together. We would smoke it together out back of the cafe, and then we would come in and work our shift, and we'd go into the back office of the owner's office, and we'd smoke weed in there together. We'd, smoke weed with the owners. Like it was just a part of everything. And what started to happen with that was because, I kept it hidden before, then it started becoming this like, this communal accepted thing. And I was at this cafe for almost 10 years. And so it was really a part of my life. And I'm coming from this hippie background as well. I'm smoking all this weed. And so it's becoming also like it had been a part of my identity and my personality. I told you about that safety pin on my shoe to begin with. I was identifying with this counterculture, like, stoner life sort of thing from the time I was young. And though I had moved in and out of it, I then, as I started to get older, because at this point I'm in my 20s, it really started to become ingrained in who I was. I quit drinking when I was 26 years old. And so, or actually right before I was 26, 25, about to turn 26. And I looked at weed as like, it was my helper. And I started to study herbalism as well, where I got into not only the medicinal uses of plants, but I started to take it to like this deeper meaning thing where I looked at like plants as being divine. And in that, I looked at weed like it was like this divine helper that was on this earth to, help me through quitting drinking. And, that was a part of my livelihood. Because what ended up happening as well, I worked at this hippie cafe, but then when I parted ways with that place, I started to go out to Humboldt again to help to process the harvests on a friend's organic medicinal weed farm. So I started doing that again, and I did that for 7 years. And I was going out and, being in the redwoods and being completely isolated, up to my eyeballs in all of this weed, trimming weed morning to night for months at a time. I would go out there for, a month or 2 to 3 months, depending on what the harvest required. So my life was literally like interwoven with weed, and how that translated mentally and physically was that I really looked at it, like I said, that like weed was this helper plant, and that I was, doing like this was my life purpose, and my life mission was not only to be high all the time and to advocate for weed and the medicinal properties of weed, but, it was my purpose to help to, get weed to other people through the processing of the harvests. And then I ended up moving on to grow medical cannabis for a while. So that, ended up unfolding. And I looked at it like it was my purpose and my calling. And now, in retrospect, to move forward from that and to talk about how it affected me mentally, I completely isolated myself in this state of mind and in the cannabis industry. Because though we're seeing states legalize slowly but surely, for a long time, cannabis was not legal everywhere. And it wasn't legal anywhere except for California and Colorado. So I wasn't able to talk about what I did for a living unless it was other people who were in the industry, or it was people that I really trusted. And so it was extremely isolating. And not only was it isolating like the career aspect of it, but going into these little pockets of the redwood forest and, trimming 100 pounds of weed and, I didn't trim that all myself, I just want to tell you, but helping too. Being isolated in those environments, being isolated with these people that are also in the cannabis industry, it separated me from the rest of the world and the rest of society, and in that, I now in retrospect see how much it derailed my progress and my momentum as a person in my life in many, many ways, professionally, mentally. I'm being surrounded by everybody who's super high too. I'm super high. It affected my social skills, because I see this in a lot of big stoners, I have social anxiety. I am not knocking social anxiety. I understand that it's completely legit. But when I see a huge stoner say, I have social anxiety, I think to myself, you might just be high and freaked out, because that's what happened to me. Was I ended up really isolating myself because I just was baked and I didn't want to be around people, and I didn't want to be baked trying to have conversations with the general public. And I see that now. I see as I've moved forward and how I've changed, which we're going to get into in a minute. But I look back on that and I see how much that limited me. And I wasn't a lazy stoner by any means. You better trust and believe I was busting my butt, in the work that I was doing. And because I was because I was smoking so much weed, I drank a ton of coffee too during that. If you know about weed and coffee, man. It was like a perfect combo. It went together like peanut butter and jelly, which is what I would say, because I'd be super baked from the weed, and then I would drink a cup of coffee and I'd have that little dopamine boost and that little, stimulant boost, and I could do anything. And so I was not a lazy stoner by any means, and I did accomplish a lot during those 15 years, but it wasn't something that translates into the, the rest of the world and into the, the rest of my life as well. So it affected me mentally like that, where like I was stoned. I was isolated. I was affected socially. I was affected, in my career path, because I forgot to mention before I got into the whole weed thing super hard, I had gone to culinary school, and working with food and culinary has always been my passion, and my whole career path with that derailed obviously to work with weed. So, and I can't put this on a resume, I can't put that I grew weed and trimmed weed for, at that point, 8, 9 years. I can't put that on a resume. So that's something that, affected my life. So let's get into, to wrap up this video, because it's getting a little bit long here, like, how did I quit? Actually, we'll get into that in another video, like specifically how I quit. But you know what? I quit. I will say, though, that it wasn't fun. For a minute, it wasn't the worst, though. I kind of expected it to be worse because of how long I had used for, but it wasn't actually that bad. There was a couple weeks of discomfort. There was a couple weeks of recalibrating and learning how to eat and learning how to sleep and learning how to motivate myself being sober. But it actually was really cool when I look back on it, because that recalibration process was what was kind of leading me into, being free from it. And it wasn't as much of a physical process to me outside of those 2 weeks, but there definitely was like this whole like relearning that I had to go through, because I had spent such a chunk of my life being high and learning how to do everything high and having it ingrained into my mental pathways that like, oh, if you're gonna do the dishes, or you're going to go to the grocery store, or you're going to smoke weed first, and you're going to have a cup of coffee, and at the end of the day you're going to smoke weed. And so I had to relearn and rewire my brain essentially to not do those things. But it's been really cool afterwards, and so I'll talk about that, like how has my life changed. Dude, it's been so cool. And sometimes I'll joke around because weed is legal here and there's a lot of people who consume it. And because I would, was such a big part of my life for so long, I'll still talk shop with people, I'll still talk, about what strains they're smoking right now. Or, I do know some people who are getting into growing, and I love, talking about that kind of stuff, but I have no desire to consume it. Like I love how I feel. I love, for me to sit down and do this, 22-minute video so far, and to be able to cohesively articulate everything that I'm saying. It's so cool, man. What's so cool is how I'm able to relate socially, because I was literally blazed for 15 years. And when I would go into public, like I was paranoid that people would know that I was high, and I wasn't like as sharp and on point, and I wasn't able to relate socially to people. And that's been one of the biggest blessings of it all, is that when I go out now, I'm not afraid of like, interacting with people because I'm high. I can communicate, I can be sharp, I can be focused, and I actually really enjoy, going into situations where there's a bunch of people that I don't know. And it's super cool, man. Super cool. And my career path has opened up. I went back to working with food, which is super cool. What else? Gained a bunch of weight, which is awesome, because you would think like I'm high, like I have the munchies all the time, but like it was weird. I would smoke weed and I would drink coffee, and then my appetite would go away. So I would like a lot of times not even eat until the end of the day, because I would just be grinding through the day. And so I was able to like, gain weight, feel good about that, recalibrate my relationship with food, because I was just eating a bunch of garbage when I was high all the time. And so I was able to, I'll mention that as well, that I found out that I had a bunch of underlying health stuff going on from nutritional deficiencies and food intolerances that were kind of masked by using the weed and being high. So I was able to deal with that. Yeah, so many good things. And I'm not tempted to go back. I have used CBD a couple times since I quit, And I have used it when I have been sick, and I see the benefits in CBD, but I don't like to ingest the plant really in any way unless it's for like a purpose. If I ever had like, I don't know, like there might be certain circumstances in the future, like it would have to be like really debilitating, literally life or death sort of stuff. Like if I had surgery or if I, had a terminal illness or something, I would consider using actual, full cannabis with the THC in it. But I have no desire to use THC kind of ever again, unless there were those circumstances. I definitely have no desire to smoke anything ever again. I love my life. I love who I am in this sobriety. I do joke around with the people that I talk about, weed with, and, as they cross my path, that I will always be an old hippie stoner at heart. I just, don't use weed anymore. I don't have a problem with it if you enjoy it and you use it. I also want to give the disclaimer that I lightly mentioned before, that not everybody is like me. You may be able to use weed occasionally. It's not a big deal. You may have used weed once and you hate it and you never use it again. But there are people out there like me because I've met them, and I wanted to share my experience with it. Because if you are in that right now, I want to let you know, this isn't like to be like, oh, quit. But I want to just let you know like how cool it is on the other side of it, and how many benefits I have experienced, and how I've seen my life kind of open up for me. One last thing that just popped into my mind before we jump off of here is that, like, dude, I can go on vacations now and like not have to worry about like bringing it with me, or like sneaking out to get high when I'm around my family and like all that kind of stuff. And like there is freedom in this. There is freedom in sobriety from weed, from anything. And I want to end on that like to be free and to not need anything is so freaking rad. So if that's something that appeals to you, I encourage you to join our community and stick around as we talk about stuff like this some more. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you next time. Bye.